This episode is presented by Yahoo Fantasy. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy Flex Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Raybon. And today's episode is very special. It is our 7th annual Expert's Guide to Fantasy Football. And today's episode sponsored by Yahoo Fantasy. And what better fantasy analyst to do an expert guide with than the expert himself, Mr. Sean Koerner. Sean, congrats on another great season, 3-year run of being top 5 in terms of rankings accuracy. What's going on?
What's up? Yeah, this is what our 7th or 8th time we're doing this expert guide on how to, win your fantasy football league. So looking forward to hopping in and discussing with you.
Yeah, and we're going to go through pretty much everything that we check boxes for as we're going through our leagues and our process. And, the advantage for us is that we get to do it all year round. So I think the rankings take a big step out of if you might be listening to this and you still consider yourself newer to the game, or obviously there's never a shortage of things to learn, even for guys like us, but we're going to give you all the knowledge we have. And if you're getting ready to go in and try to crush your league this year, why not use the same projections that we use? Because guess what? You can. Our Fantasy Labs NFL subscription gives you access to all of those player rankings, customizable draft cheat sheets, and more. New subscribers can use code FLEX20, that's FLEX20, for $20 off at fantasylabs.com/flex. So go win your league with the number 4 and the number 6, 2 top 6, 33% of the top 6 fantasy football most accurate preseason rankers of the past 3 seasons. And I can only speak for Sean. I know he's probably even better than that and in season. So make sure that you go and use that code FLEX20 for $20 off at fantasylabs.com/flex. So this pod is going to be 2 main sections. It's going to be how to win, and then it's going to be position by position. What are we looking for when we're actually evaluating these players? But let's start with how do we win. Sean, you've done a lot of winning in fantasy over the past, I'm not even going to date you, but I'm going to say a very, very large stretch of your life. So
You could say it.
Tell us how you do it.
30 years, about 3 decades. A long, long time. Randy Moss's rookie season was actually my first draft ever, if you want to date me. But yeah, I think at a high level, just general, principles on how to win, especially if you're starting, for the first time in a specific format, is to have specific player rankings by position for that specific league based on the league scoring. So there's unique leagues that reward 4 points for a passing touchdown or 6 points for a passing touchdown or full PPR, things like that. You just want to make sure that your rankings are based on that league's scoring. And then from there, you kind of want to have a general idea of your draft strategy based on where you're picking from. So when you have picks 1 through 4 or 9 through 12, you're probably going to have a different strategy just based on the players that you're going to even have access to in the first few rounds. And then from there, you're going to have to draft according to position needs. So having a basic draft plan, for the first, 4 picks, middle of the draft or later is important. And then I know you're going to talk about this. We both agree, but average draft position is so key. Knowing when players are going to go is the name of the game, because that kind of dictates your strategy of, you got to take a certain player because he's not going to make it back to you. Or, you know that these certain players will fall to this round, so they're a nice backup plan. But specifically for your league, ideally you're in a league with friends, family, where you really know what teams and players they like. And that'll give you a better sense as to when players are going to go ahead or behind ADP. So if you're in a league of buddies that, have a handful of Bears, diehard Bears fans, you have to assume players like Caleb Williams, DJ Moore, Colson Loveland might go a little earlier than ADP. So just having a good sense of your league in general and how and when they'll draft is critical. But I think, having good rankings based on projections and understanding, average draft position, when guys will go, is the key to having a successful draft, which is obviously very important when it comes to building, winning fantasy football team.
Yeah, absolutely. At its core, winning in fantasy football it starts with the draft, and the draft is about maximizing your value in relation to the draft capital that you have. And that could come in big chunks. It could come all in a few players, but it's possible it can come as much as almost every single pick or round in the draft. So you have to be aware of how to build edges in different ways. And I think ADP, because of that, is the most valuable draft data point, because even if I didn't have my rankings or my projections, I would at least know I would know the consensus, and I would know how to fade them. So you're not going to win by following ADP. That's why accurate rankings are so important. But knowing that ADP is something that is an average and that it's generally predictive of how the draft's going to unfold overall, it gives you a lot of ways to attack. And I think sometimes you're going to see edges in terms of positional value. That is a big thing where, let's say you have rankings and those rankings are correct from a positional standpoint in terms of, generally, but there could still be a lot of different ways the draft could unfold. If you had, let's say, Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry as the, running back 2 and 3 last year. Well, if everyone's just fading running back for the first 2 rounds, it completely changes up the draft. And so I think the key is understanding the value in terms of positions, not just players within those positions, and then being able to take advantage of that as the draft unfolds. Everything you're trying to do, all the edges you're trying to build, they can happen even when you're not picking, because not only are you trying to maximize positional value, which tends to happen when there's a run on a certain position. And, last year, a lot of people drafting wide receiver early. This year, there's a point late in the first round, early second, where there's a bunch of running backs, some more risky than others go. So there's always these kind of pockets, and we'll talk about one of our favorite pockets a bit later on the show, but there are positional pockets that tend to emerge year after year. So that's one of your biggest edges. Always understanding how to fade the consensus is key, because what you see with average draft position is when you start going off the board by more than a round's worth of picks early in drafts, that's when you start seeing a downtick. But if you're generally keeping it to guys where they wouldn't make it back to you the next round, that's when I think you shouldn't be hesitant to follow ADP or rankings, whatever it is, to the T each time. You're going to get a lot of potential outcomes that are different by switching it up, especially if you draft, more than one team. Like, you don't want to just be kind of going by, these strict rules, because it's going to let the draft kind of determine, it's going to dictate too much. You want to be in position to dictate. So I think the biggest edges tend to come from fading ADP, but within doing it well and knowing how to do it, not just doing it for the sake of being contrarian, because there's still only a small window of players that you're going to really want to pivot to. But fading the media, I think, is something that's so easy. I mean, there's just so many puff pieces this time of year. So you're going to be able to fade the media pretty much all year. And everything's just gotten crazier with the bots and AI and just the current media landscape. So I'm sure that's going to be even more valuable. But you also got to know how to fade experts. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of very smart people in this industry. Obviously you're one of them, Sean, but whatever the dominant strategy emerges between, a certain consensus of experts, it's going to influence a lot of drafts. And you have to kind of understand, what's going on there. And that if everyone else is kind of doing the same strategy that was only supposed to work because no one was doing it, it's probably not going to work. So there's a lot to just really nailing that positional value and trying to find your edges by slowly but surely, cumulatively, every round, building up a little bit more of an edge. And by not taking busts early, I think that is one of the biggest things. So really understanding not necessarily who you're going to target, because you don't know who's going to exactly be there, but you can control who you can kind of fade. So I think that's always a big one for me, Sean, is early in drafts. You always say you can't really win your league, but you can lose it. And I think it's the same thing with sleepers versus busts or targets versus busts. It's like, you can't control who's there at your draft slot, but you can control who you don't draft, because you kind of have a strong opinion about, okay, well, either they're not going to be there, or if they are, I'm not taking them. So I always actually valued my kind of do not draft list a little more than my targets list, because I think that's really where drafts are won early in the league or lost early in the draft.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just when it comes to the first few rounds, again, you're just trying to avoid disaster. And sometimes it's out of your control. Like heading into the season, we didn't know Christian McCaffrey was dealing with like an Achilles injury that, pretty much wiped out his entire season. That can happen. That's outside of your control. But there are guys in the first few rounds that are risky. Maybe they are dealing with a known injury heading into the season, or they're on a new team, or they're getting older, where they just have more risk than other players in the first few rounds. And that's kind of what I like to do, is avoid those guys. Just go the safest route, because, all those guys are, being drafted in the first few rounds for a reason. They're pretty much all going to do well if they stay healthy. So I just, play it safe. And then it's the middle to later rounds. That's when I'm swinging for the fences, taking big chances where a guy, he's not a guaranteed lock to go off this year, but that's when I'm more willing to take risks where, the first few rounds, I may be playing it much, much safer and being a little bit more conservative when it comes to, who I'm drafting.
Exactly. And that's why the ability to adjust dynamically to your draft is so important. And it's something that the best way to do it is just to have the knowledge yourself and be prepared, because there have been over the years, and you've mentioned it, you've been doing this for 3 decades. I'm around the same, and we've seen so many different strategies come and go, and so many different methods of doing it. And now, I'm sure everyone thinks they can kind of do it with AI and this and different things like that. And at the end of the day, if you rely on anything other than being present with the correct knowledge in your draft, you're not maximizing your potential edges. So I think that, kind of getting those things out of the way, making sure you have your rankings, making sure you have everything so that you can just draft and not worry, not be overloaded with decision fatigue. And that's where I think, even things like, people don't talk about this as much in fantasy, but winning the intangible game, right? You kind of alluded to it, Sean, league rules, scoring settings, if somebody's drafting in more than one league, if they might not be paying as much attention to that. Or I think another one is just when it comes to these projections that we do, I think one of the biggest edges for us is always, we find that even compared to a lot of consensus and other experts, players who are going to miss time with injury or suspension, that's already like guaranteed to happen pretty much, like it's already a certainty. Those players tend to be very overvalued. It's really hard to kind of properly value them when it's not, it's going to be something less than a full season, and maybe even something less than 3/4 of a season. So, things like that, winning the intangible game. I think one of the keys that people tend to struggle with at all levels of fantasy is the late rounds. And on one hand, you could look at the numbers and say there's not a lot of important picks that get chosen there, but that's the whole point. As you said, Sean, you got to play it safe early to put yourself in position that if you hit one of those picks, it should be game over, because there's only going to be so many, Puka Nakuras and guys like that each year. Bucky Irving, who you nailed. But if you didn't set up your team and you took too many chances early, and it's not a best ball format, and we'll do a whole nother pot on that, by the way, because it's such a different, even though a lot of times the ranks more or less come up similarly, it's a whole different strategy. But I think it's really about, kind of winning all these different ways in drafts, and, putting yourself in position to where, hitting on a mid-round pick, a late-round pick, when it gets less likely, is going to do even more for you. So, what do you kind of do when as you're going through a draft and you're, trying to get into that point in the draft where you're saying, okay, I kind of played it safe early on. I, prioritize my floors, and other people are probably dropping like flies because they're making bad picks. When do you start to pivot? What comes into play? What are you thinking about?
I think it depends on every draft. Again, it's kind of where your draft slot position is. That kind of dictates that for me. But typically the middle rounds, I think people aren't willing enough to be aggressive when it comes to the middle rounds. If you drafted teams last year, go look at your draft and see how many players you end up dropping, from like round 5 or 6. Like sometimes it's funny to go see like how off we all were, like ADP was on some of these guys. So I'm willing to take shots pretty early on. But I think at a larger point, I think this is where like mock drafting and just getting your hands dirty certainly helps, because, I play around with what happens if I take, a quarterback early like Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. Like, can I still get the team I want? And by just having, a lot of mock drafts under my belt, I kind of understand the builds that make sense, the players that I keep, finding fall to me in, rounds 6 through 9. So I think just doing mock drafts and like really trying out certain strategies and seeing what works, what doesn't, it actually helps me take care of blind spots. Early on, like a couple of months ago, my first, drafts I was doing, I was realizing I wasn't taking receiver early enough. So you just kind of hone in on your strategy when you do all these mock drafts. But typically, rounds 5 through 10, I think, are critical to take the guys that you're high on. Like you said, you don't always want to follow ADP. That's not how you win. You got to take stands on certain guys, draft guys a little bit ahead of ADP, making sure you get them, knowing which guys will fall in ADP. So I think just getting as many reps as possible to kind of get your strategy down. Because again, it changes based on your draft order. But again, I think that those rounds 5 through 10 are so critical on getting those league winner type guys.
Yeah. And that's what we're doing like maniacs in March. And
Yeah.
I mean, for anyone that's not familiar with best ball, the average draft position is so sharp. The minute the draft happens, people have already been taking these rookies, what seems like way too high, and it tends to be higher than they go sometimes in August drafts. So that's what we're kind of doing. But I found that, first of all, if you're more of a newbie or intermediate, like that's going to be that's going to all be reflected in our rankings. If you're really trying to be an expert, but you don't want to do, or you don't have time to do like 100 mock drafts, like probably even more than that. I mean, we get it under our belts between like real drafts, mock drafts, everything in between. I think the most valuable thing for me is just looking at the average draft position, which again is why I say it's always the most valuable data point, in my opinion, because you could just kind of look at it round by round, apply to your league or whatever, and start from the bottom and say, okay, if I'm in a 12-team league that goes 15 rounds, who do I like in round 15? Just asking yourself that question and saying, and a lot of times what you're going to find is, there's a couple quarterbacks here that I would take, and we'll start to get into the weeds on positional strategy, metrics that we like to use and don't. But generally speaking, if you look at the draft kind of upside down, even if you're not necessarily mocking or doing real drafts or something like that, just kind of being able to look and say, okay, these are the players that tend to be available here, and these are the guys, these are the positions that kind of stand out. These are the guys that stand out against that ADP. Sometimes there's a lot. Sometimes it's half the quarterbacks, the backup quarterbacks. Sometimes it's only one or two guys. So, and you never know who's going to be there. It's average draft position, but it's so valuable because I think what happens a lot of times is if you're drafting against people that you're better than, that they're naturally probably one of the reasons you're better than them is because they're not putting as much effort or they don't have as much knowledge about the late rounds. But even experts, because we do this so often and we do this all year round, I think we tend to be biased toward the guys we like and that we tout. And so there's multiple ways to kind of get an edge regardless of who you're playing against. And there's so much upside to it because a lot of the picks you can make late, like you got like a guy like let's say you just throw Keaton Mitchell or somebody on your team, they're going to screw guys. If they hit, they're also going to screw teams that drafted players early, even if it doesn't happen quite like that. It's a lot of times what will happen is, I remember us always talking about like Kadarius Toney was a guy that I think we were low on. And if you drafted the guy that would go after him, or with Shanahan's backfield a lot of times, the guy that goes after him much later, somebody wasted a draft pick. And that's why I say it's all about building those edges and avoiding busts early, because by avoiding a bust, you could win 12 times in a round. Let's say in a hypothetical situation, there were, everyone else in a 12-team league chose a bust and you chose somebody that smashed. You didn't win. You didn't just get an edge once that round. You got an edge 12 times. So I think that's how you have to think about it in terms of getting an edge, and that you can do it in so many different ways, and you have to use all of them, and it's going to change depending on your draft. Fantasy Flex listeners, it's your boy Chris Raybon here, and August 23rd, make sure you save the date. Joe's on Weed Street in Chicago. Sean Koerner is going to be there. I'm going to be there. Some special guests will be there as well. All you need to do, RSVP, link in the episode description. It is free. Looking forward to seeing you there. All right, Sean, anything else you want to add on just high level, drafting? I think we one thing I want to get your thoughts on before we jump to positions is drafting based on rankings and how to do it and how not to do it, because you go to rankings every year, and I know sometimes you get frustrated because there could still be times when somebody drafts wrong, so to speak, off your rankings. Yeah. So kind of talk to me about what that's about.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point because our rankings are going to differ from ADP. Where we're going to have a guy we rank 30 slots higher than ADP, let's say. So that's like 2 to 3 rounds ahead of ADP. And a common mistake I see people make is they draft that guy where we have him ranked. So a couple rounds early. In theory, that's good because, we are projecting that guy to be better than the market thinks. But you're kind of killing the value by doing that, because the idea is you want to get him as close to ADP as possible, knowing that he's better than where he's getting drafted. Or in theory, he's offering more upside than where he's getting drafted. Now, that doesn't mean you just wait until, exactly where he goes. You will want to, take that guy a little bit ahead of ADP so you make sure you get him. But again, you want to wait as long as possible, as long as you can, in theory, to get him. That's kind of how you're locking in the value, is getting that guy a couple rounds later than he should, is the name of the game, in my opinion. And, that's, I haven't rolled them out yet, but over the next couple weeks, I'm going to have my tiers and strategy pieces for every position. And I think it's also important to kind of talk about the idea of tiers in general. I like to bucket guys within position within tiers, because a lot of the guys that we rank, we could have, say, wide receivers 10 through 20 separated by like a point or two. So we really consider all those guys interchangeable, where someone's taking the wide receiver 10 in round 2, whereas somebody going in round 4 is just like a couple points lower in our projections, but you're getting them a couple rounds later. So knowing that, you can kind of decide when to draft certain positions. So I get like way more detailed and granular level when in my tiers pieces, but it's important to just kind of bucket players within the positions themselves in tiers to kind of get a sense when it's important, when it's critical to attack a position, because there's going to be a big drop off from that player to the next. So I think at a high level, when it comes to that, you're thinking in terms of tiers, but also, like you said, when you're comparing rankings to ADP, you don't want to rob the value by taking them too early. You do want to draft them as late as you can, as close to ADP. That's how you're locking in value, and that's the mistake I see people see, is they just draft based on our rankings, which is smart, but you need to be factoring in when they're going as well.
Absolutely. And it's even more crucial when you're drafting in those first few rounds. I would say the first 5 or 6 rounds, because that's when you're drafting the core of your team. And there's always so high for a guy to go. There's not going to be a big edge to necessarily a guy who is taken, let's say, in the 3rd round instead of the 5th. Like, he still only has 2 rounds to go up. It might be a big value compared to the consensus in our ranks or somebody else's ranks, but at the end of the day, a guy taken early, there's only so much higher he can go in terms of ceiling. So there's a kind of a limit to how much you can win. So that's why, to your point, you want to just ideally get him at or below ADP. And that's really kind of what it is almost throughout the draft. You're trying to get guys at or below ADP. You're really never trying to reach, especially in traditional non-best ball formats where there's not even stacking coming into play necessarily, because even if there's a positional run, a lot of times it can make the most sense to, or the value is going to show in not just following it blindly. It's going to be to pivot to maybe not even like, if let's say there's a big run on running backs, sometimes it might not even be worth it to like, okay, just take the next wide receiver. Maybe now you can get a team with Brock Bowers and a stud quarterback or something like that, that teams that you just couldn't build if there wasn't this run. So there's a lot of different ways to gain an edge, and it's all going to depend on how the draft unfolds. And that's really what we're trying to stress, is that there are these different ways to get edges, and there are methods to do them, but there's no one way. There's no one strategy. There's no one thing. Average draft position is an average. So always remember that. I think that is so key, and it's a good segue into positional strategy. And man, it used to just be running backs. Everyone was taking running backs at the top of the draft, and then somewhere along the line, the NFL got smart to it, and they started realizing that, just like as fantasy owners started realizing, these guys get hurt a lot. Maybe we shouldn't build our entire offenses around them, our entire teams around them. And so the league's changed a lot, and what's resulted is receivers are just as I would say at this point, tend to be more valuable early on than running backs. And there is a big reason for that, and we're going to get into it. But what it really creates is a situation where you still have your stud running backs. You still have your stud receivers, obviously. But after that, there's a frozen pond, right, Sean? Just I
Yep.
mean, what is the frozen pond? Tell everybody out there.
Yeah, so I mean, just at a high level, you made an excellent point that just running backs, they're still very important in fantasy, but they are the most fragile position for a variety of reasons. But there is this range now where us other experts are very cautious when we're drafting running backs because we know the risks, and a lot of people call it the dead zone. I don't love that name because it implies you don't want anybody in this range. That's not true either. I think there's going to be guys we want to target in this range, but I like calling it the frozen pond tier because um, in theory it's, all these running backs on surface seem safe. They're heading into week 1 as the team starting running back, let's say, or they had a really good season last year. They seem safe on the surface, but you and I can identify red flags where one thing can change and boom, their value tanks. Their floor is much lower than people realize. And what happens if you're walking on like a frozen pond and it cracks? You're cooked, and it happens instantly. Doesn't mean that you can't get across the pond unscathed, but that's kind of the range. I would say like running backs 10 through 30 are kind of in that bucket, where for any number of reasons, and I know you have your reasons to potentially avoid some of these backs, but it can include changing teams or changing schemes. They might be getting older, they might be on the wrong side of 30. They might not have a strong of grip on the lead role like people might think. Like last year I kept saying Rachaad White, he has the most competition he's ever seen in, his 3 years in the NFL, with Bucky Irving now backing him up. So things like that can be a red flag, but that's kind of the term we use for these running backs. We're in the, running back 10 through 30 range where on the surface it might seem, nice and shiny, but there might be some reasons why, they're going to tank. You might, not be able to play them, or might have to outright drop them based on all these reasons. But it's a very risky and delicate range to be drafting running backs, is the frozen pond tier.
Absolutely, and we'll talk exactly how to draft running backs in the frozen pond tier. But now that we've kind of told you guys what it is, what exactly the frozen pond tier of running backs is as a definition, let's look at a couple. Let's just tease a couple that we have our eye on heading into 2025, presented by Yahoo Fantasy. Sean, kick us off.
Yeah, I'd say Aaron Jones of the Vikings is one that sticks out for me. He's being drafted around running back 25, which again on the surface seems like a steal because he finished RB 16 last year. Granted, he played every single game. He didn't get injured, miss any time. So that alone is kind of a red flag. Typically, running backs do miss a handful of games. So he was very fortunate in terms of his injury luck last year. But he didn't have much competition. He had, Cam Akers and Ty Chandler were his backups. So they couldn't really push him for touches. This year they brought in Jordan Mason, who I think is very talented. He thrived on the Niners last year when Christian McCaffrey was out. And they're already saying, he might eat into Aaron Jones' goal line usage. So this is a situation where Aaron Jones, he's on the wrong side of 30. He's already 30. He's turning 31 this year. He has added competition, Jordan Mason. And, he played every single game last year. So I think he's going to be drafted closer to his ceiling. And his floor is much lower because, at times last year he had fumbling issues and they tried to bench him, but they didn't have anybody that could replace him. So there's a chance that Mason could outright replace Aaron Jones this year. So it's a risky situation. So, at running back 25, I think Aaron Jones kind of fits the bill of somebody I would consider as part of the frozen pond tier.
I mean, frozen pond, it seems like a old school NFC Central type of deal, but it's the NFC North now. I'm going to stay in that division. I'm going to go with the guy drafted even higher than Jones, and that's David Montgomery going at running back 21. He does have the red flag of there's definitely a guy to replace him, and Jahmyr Gibbs might have just earned himself a bigger share of the workload just with his performance last year. You have a new coaching staff. You're expecting the Lions to have a tougher overall schedule and thus game scripts, which tend to hurt early down backs a lot more because they're not getting as many chances in the receiving game. They're not getting as many chances to score touchdowns because the team isn't running at the goal line as much and not getting to the goal line as much. And that describes Montgomery's reliance of and where he scores the most of his fantasy points to a T. He's also now at that and going to be past that peak age for running backs. He started to deal with some injuries. I just think there are a lot of red flags for Montgomery. And then you look at his efficiency, which is not always the most important thing for a running back if he has a locked in role. And Montgomery still will have some role, of course, but his efficiency went down last year. And that's not a good sign, especially because it wasn't just his after contact efficiency. It was before contact. And while that does tend to also bring in some of the offensive line for Detroit is probably going to be a lot worse, especially on the interior where Montgomery makes most of his hay. So just a lot of things kind of pointing toward we've been getting rich kind of taking Montgomery as a steal these last few years and him outplaying ADP and still finishing as the RB2. But now there's not as much room for error unless you're just expecting Gibbs to miss more than the normal running back games by probably at least double, like if maybe he has to miss 6 or 7. So I am all in on Montgomery on the frozen pond. We got 2 NFC North running backs, and fantasy football is back. So fire up the group chats, get those draft boards ready, and buckle up for a season filled with breakouts, busts, overreactions, and more. It's all happening this year. And Sean and I, we're playing on Yahoo Fantasy, and you should too. So whether you're a first timer or you're a vet making your millionth league, now's the time to get excited. Yahoo Fantasy has been the premier fantasy platform for as long as I can remember, and I was just I was playing against strangers. That's how long ago I can tell you that I've been playing on Yahoo. So I just want to say you should be too. And to celebrate 28 years of Yahoo's fantasy greatness, Yahoo Fantasy is dropping 28 big new features over 28 days, giving you more ways to play, more ways to draft, and more ways to win. It all begins August 4th. So stay tuned. Get started by creating or joining a Yahoo Fantasy Football League today at yahoofantasy.com/flex. That's yahoofantasy.com/flex. Also, August 4th. Shout out to my mom. Happy birthday, Mom. Happy early birthday. That's her birthday. So big day for a lot of different reasons, but big day right now because we're going to get to talk about the frozen pond. And I mean, it is so frozen this year. It's one way or another, the frozen pond tier is going to dictate all drafts. Because, I mean, talk to me about just the strategy of wide receiver versus running back, but with the added wrinkle that this year, almost everyone in drafts is avoiding running backs in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th rounds. So it's kind of how does that affect your draft strategy? How should that be affecting people's draft strategies with this kind of massive swing toward these middle round wide receivers and away from the running backs?
Yeah, I think it's moving closer to my overall draft strategy. Is I definitely try to get 2 to 3 wide receivers as early as possible, because just when it comes to the wide receiver position, it's much, much tougher to be adding guys from the waiver wire in season that end up being, studs, like a top 20 type player. Whereas running back, again, it's so volatile that it adds risk on drafting guys early because they can get hurt, they can lose their job, things like that. But, all these backups are in play where if somebody misses time, another guy could step up. A good example is someone like Zach Charbonnet. I had, on my bench in a lot of leagues last year where, I'm not playing him when Kenneth Walker's healthy, but once he misses time, I know I have a top 10 running back, so I could just plug him in. You don't really get that with wide receivers. If Drake London misses time, Ray McLeod isn't all of a sudden a top 20 wide receiver. So it just goes to like most of the time there's only one running back on the field where, they might have 2 to 4, sometimes 5 wide receivers on the field. It just has to go with opportunity. These running backs, they're getting tackled 20 plus times a game. So they're getting hit the most. They're usually the smaller player on the field. So they're more prone to injury. So a lot of different reasons why running backs are so volatile and risky taking early on, which is why I think the public is, having a better sense of that and gravitating more towards the zero RB approach and, valuing wide receivers a lot more. So it's not really changing anything on my end because, again, you're looking at the same thing as me. All of these running backs from like 10 through 30, I could create a scenario where, they're going to be a disaster for you this year. It doesn't mean all of them are going to, bust, but it's just very risky. Whereas, when you look at receivers, most of these guys, for wide receiver 10 through 30 are all excellent. And I want as many of them as possible. So it just has to go with the nature of the position itself, the game itself. And, just knowing when you can get these certain players. So again, I'm still, valuing wide receiver very highly in the first several rounds of the draft because of this.
Yeah. And it's important to also consider the context of this particular year and of every year. 2025 is a year where the zero RB strategy tended to fall flat on its face.
Yeah.
And, now we have another opportunity to use it. It's something where there's no correct strategy. You can win with all the different strategies. If you look at the long-term data, almost every year there's a way to win any which way, but there does tend to be a bit of bias. And so the thing to remember is that there are going to be drafts where you might end up getting running back early because everyone else is thinking that same thing. It really comes down to the value. And I think when the entire board gets sharper, which I think it did, it's just going to put the onus on the individual drafter to make sure that they are truly taking advantage of value versus ADP and not just blindly following a strategy because they predicted that it was going to be the best one heading into the draft. The key is to know how to use every strategy, know what it looks like. And that's why we tend to be so comfortable fading running backs in the middle rounds, because what's going to happen is you don't know which of those guys in the frozen pond are going to sink to you, I guess you could say, but some of them will, and you just take the dip on those guys. And that's the whole point. How do I leverage the value at different pockets in the draft? The answer isn't to necessarily always stockpile running backs. Some years it'll work better than others. With some players and some draft spots, it'll work better than with others. But at the end of the day, you have to look at it and say, I might be better off treating all these guys as interchangeable. And because I see there's a lot more difference at wide receiver, at tight end, at quarterback, even in terms of guys you can get. So it's not necessarily like look at this and say I have to draft 2 running backs early like it's 1998 again, but also I don't have to be, on this zero RB strategy. I just have to understand in what scenarios in a draft, depending on, what is it, a super flex, is it a normal 1 QB league where there's always going to be quarterbacks around, and tight ends this year too. You have to understand that there's going to be an arms race at receiver one way or another. So I'm usually just like you. I'm trying to draft at least as many wide receivers in those first 6 rounds as I have flex positions starting in my league, and preferably one more than that, because wide receivers tend to miss about 1 to 2 games. Last year it was a little higher for wide receivers, which is part of the reason everything went kind of haywire and swung across to running backs. So running backs are really the only position that is missing. Instead of it's 1 to 2, it's for running backs it's usually 3 to 4 or more. So that just changes the whole math. But even at receiver, if you're starting, let's say 3 in a flex, you're expecting 6 to 8 games missed plus bye weeks. So you're gonna need to treat the draft, I think. And I'm curious as to how you approach this, Sean, but I kind of think of it as there's a part of the draft when startable players are available, and there's a part of the draft where startable players are not available any longer. And that just comes down to your starting lineup size in a league, but it tends to be around the 10th round. So I usually have, rather than any kind of specific strategy, I'm going to do this in the first round, this in the second round, running back, wide receiver. I'm looking at it like I need at least 5 top 40 wide receivers. I want at least 3 top 50 running backs. And then depending on what else happens, my quarterback and tight end will kind of fit into that. Usually it comes a little toward the later half, but how do you kind of approach the different positions in terms of, are there any cutoffs for you? Or you tend to be looking at it, with the early rounds and then a distinct strategy? Like, how are you kind of setting up those tiers to work for you as the draft progresses?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I definitely think similarly where, by round 10, I want at least 5 receivers. I think it's important to also consider the league settings. Some leagues only use 2 wide receivers versus 3 when it comes to your starting lineup. So in leagues where you're only starting 2 receivers and still just 1 flex, I'm going to lower that number a bit. Maybe I'll want 4 wide receivers by round 10. But I think it's critical to understand your league specifically. But yeah, in general, wide receiver is the one I think is the most important to attack early. And like you said, just kind of as quarterbacks and tight ends, if they fall to me, great. If not, I am more than willing to not draft a quarterback or a tight end in the top 10 if it works out that way, because over the past few seasons, I've gone into leagues where I don't even have a quarterback and I just stream, and you can usually produce a top 10 quarterback that way, and you might even stumble on someone like Bo Nix wasn't drafted in every league and he ended up being a top 10 quarterback. I know you were high on Jaden Daniels. You could have got him later in the draft. So there's just so many guys year after year that you could end up stumbling on, even if you punt quarterback or tight end. Tight end specifically has had a ton of league winners that you can get later on. So I'm usually not, worried if I don't have a quarterback or tight end by, say, round 10. And then, like you said, I'm stockpiling my bench. Typically with backup running backs, I think that have a ton of upside if the starting running back were to go down. So you're right. After you get to round 10, you're going to be drafting guys that might not be startable right away, and I think that's when it makes sense to reload up with backup running backs. And one thing to point, I think you touch on it briefly, but just last year, running back position overall was very healthy. I think it was only Christian McCaffrey that missed more than like 3 games. That was a running back that was drafted, early on. So last year, a lot of these backs played all 17 games, which is not common. Typically, backs miss 2 to 3 games on average. And, oftentimes we have a handful of running backs miss, several games. So last year we just didn't see that. So a lot of these backup running backs didn't hit because of that. So I think people might, look into that a little bit too much from last year. But at the end of the day, the running back position is very volatile, and you can land guys, outside of round 10 that hit. So at the end of the day, the first several rounds I'm loading up at receiver and running backs that fall to me, or quarterback, tight end when it makes sense. So that's kind of my general approach. But then, when you're in the draft, you have to adjust. But overall, that's my plan heading in.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a key point late just now when you said tight end and quarterback when it makes sense. And it's so true because there's a fragility to quarterback and tight end rankings because and ADP, because if you look at this year, for example, there's only about 8 to 10 of them going in the first 5, 6 rounds combined. There's just not many quarterbacks and tight ends going. So if a guy goes around earlier or a couple of guys go around earlier and someone else goes around later, I mean, it can lead to wild swings in terms of value, and it's something to consider a lot more, I think, when you're in high stakes leagues where you have to beat not just maybe 12, 11 other people of your friends, but you got to beat an entire industry expert or something like that. That's where you really want to take those bigger risk. And I say risk because not that I think Brock Bowers is catching, less than 90 balls if he's healthy. But what I mean is there's just so much risk because there's so many other wide receivers there and running backs that people are fading that are also valuable. So it's really about the kind of prioritization of wide receiver, then running back, then tight end, and then quarterback, because even bad quarterbacks are there's just less of a drop off versus a bad tight end could give you nothing. So
yeah,
I think it's important to because now I think the new trend, and I'm glad it's here, is there's a lot more super flex with quarterbacks eligible, and there's a lot more 2 QB leagues, but there's also just a lot more people willing to wait to draft a quarterback. So talk to me a little bit more, just like how you evaluate quarterbacks, because I think rushing upside is starting to come into it, or it's always come into it, but it tends to be something that it's almost like a cheat code this day and age, even though people are onto it.
Yeah, absolutely. Rushing upside has been key. You and I have been harping on it for years now. That's how we ended up with Jalen Hurts as a rookie several years ago. That's how you ended up on Jaden Daniels last year. I think, rushing upside is the cheat code. It's why someone like Justin Fields might not be a great real life quarterback, but when he's playing, he could put up top 12 numbers because of his rushing upside. So it's absolutely critical. I think I would say that for like 1 QB leagues, especially because we're shooting for upside. Now you mentioned super flex, 2 QB leagues. That's a completely different strategy. That's when you're drafting quarterbacks earlier, and often because at any given time there's only 32 starting quarterbacks. So if you're starting 24 of them across the league a week, the supply is not there to everyone just sit there and wait for quarterbacks. So in 2 QB super flex leagues, they go much, much faster, or they go much earlier because there's higher demand. Now in those leagues, the Sam Darnolds, Jordan Love, CJ Stroud, guys that, go outside the top 12. I think those guys are more valuable because, they're going to provide you a higher floor, which is important in 2 QB leagues. So, the way I evaluate quarterbacks and draft them changes significantly whether you're starting 1 quarterback or 2 in a league. But yeah, when it comes to fantasy upside, I think this day and age rushing is key because it gives the quarterback a higher floor and ceiling weekly, which is a hidden way to really dominate your league, is having one of those. But there's a lot more of them these days, so it's we have more of these guys coming in like Jaden Daniels. Now Caleb Williams does have some rushing upside. Maybe we'll see more of that this year. Drake May. So there's a lot more guys with rushing upside in today's day and age. But at the end of the day, I think that's one of the secrets, I think, when it comes to sleeper picks and late round quarterbacks, is if they do have that rushing upside, they can really pop.
Yeah, and with that, I would say that's one of those situations when you start talking about these like leagues that stray from the norm, people aren't necessarily going to be even an expert like you and I aren't playing as many of those leagues as we play traditional leagues or as we play certain other leagues. So just remember that there's always going to be a little bit more dissonance in these situations, but that means there's more to exploit fundamentally if you kind of understand that you can get an edge. So like for example, if you're at the wrong end of a positional run at quarterback in a 2QB or a flex league, first of all, it makes a big difference whether it is just a 2QB or it's a 2QB plus. Like there's a lot of just that can change a lot. But one of the things you have to consider is, okay, there's always going to be four teams that essentially miss out on a week one starter. And you have to kind of say, how do I win if I'm one of those 4 teams? That's a 33% chance that there's gonna, regardless if everyone wants to have an arms race, there's only so many of them, right? So you have to think about things like, well, I can let people go on a run and just treat it like a 2QB league in the sense of, okay, I'm only losing the bye week really if I end up with say Anthony Richardson and a Daniel Jones or something. You have to kind of think outside the box and see what you're going to concede, just like real football where every defense is trying to take away something. Every offense is, they're going to dictate terms, and the defense, the best they can do, is pre-play is kind of decide what they want to take away and go from there. So it really requires a lot of not just following these general rules of thumb, but really looking into it and looking at the player value and, okay, like who do we have? If you added the 2 guys up in our projections in with your week scoring, who would what combination would be better? Would the ceiling change versus the floor and whatnot? There's a lot to it, but we started talking about quarterbacks, rushing upside for them. And one of my favorite things during the season to talk to you about is the pass catchers, because you and I both are really big on looking at very specific metrics when it comes to pass catchers. And to some people, they might be simpler than you think. To some people, it's more, it's complex, or, maybe it's not the hype ones. But talk to me a little bit about, how you're evaluating, especially wide receivers, but in general, pass catchers, starting at the route level.
Yeah. So let's talk about, say, wide receivers. First you want to see how often they're on the field running a route. So we always talk about that routes run rate as the percentage of dropbacks the quarterback's taking, where that player is running a route. So that's going to dictate if that player runs a route over 90% of the time, they're going to be more consistent. They're usually a stud in that case. They're a full-time starter, but they're going to be more consistent. Whereas someone like Jaden Reed, he is, a good wide receiver, starting wide receiver, but he's not on the field all the time. So he's going to be more dependent on game script, that type of thing. So he might be a little less consistent. And the other thing is, how far down the field are they getting their targets? So that's their ADOT, their average depth of target. So if that's between 0 and 10 yards closer to line of scrimmage, they're going to be more consistent because they're getting higher percentage throws. Whereas if somebody's getting targets downfield where their ADOT's over 15 yards, they're a downfield threat. So they're getting lower percentage targets downfield where they're going to catch less balls, and when they do, it's an explosive play. So those players to me are going to be lower floor, higher ceiling. They're going to be volatile week to week, where there's more risk to that. They're a higher risk, higher reward type player. So you got to know that you're drafting that type of player if you are drafting them, versus somebody else like a Keenan Allen type, just always consistently getting catches and yards, more stable guy, and knowing when to take those players. And we've kind of hit on that, where earlier in the draft I'm looking for more stability, whereas late I'm looking for more boom bust, high upside guys. So just those are the things that I recognize when I'm projecting a player when it comes to the underlying data is how often on their field and what type of targets are they getting?
Yeah, that's a really great way to break it down, because it goes back to how we started off talking about quarterbacks and what tends to differentiate the ones that hit for the most part is rushing upside. And that is because if you're projecting a quarterback in terms of his passing numbers, what you start to learn pretty quickly when you test out when you back test different models, is that everything's very correlated to each other with passing. And what I mean by that is, if you have a quarterback who is very efficient, but you expect him to throw less, he's usually throwing less because he was able to be even more efficient and get the same amount of yardage on less throws, because maybe his team's better, maybe the schedule is easier and whatnot. So there's a lot of kind of correlation that cancels itself out, and that it's the same thing with there's some noise there with with pass catchers in general, where if you get a lower rate of targets per route, it's not inherently a bad thing. You would expect guys who go down the field more and get more high value yardage to be targeted less, and they there's what you tend to see more as a catch rate also decreases, but a lot of times that just comes down to the quarterback accuracy. So a quarterback that's inaccurate tends to be more inaccurate the more he goes downfield. So there's noise in pass catcher data, and that's why it is very important, I think, to kind of break it down into its components. And targets per route is a very sticky stat. And then in terms of routes, run per drop, like that route rate, it's very predictable on a team level when you know the player's role. And for a lot of the guys that are going to be fantasy relevant, we have a pretty good idea of the range of outcomes. And so, for example, the average wide receiver 1 will kind of be around 90%. The number 2 receiver will be about 80 to 90% in terms of his routes run rate. The number 3 guy will be in that 50 to 70 range, and so on and so forth. The other guys will be below, kind of just rounding it out. They usually have about 2.7, the average team, 2.7 wide receiver routes per drop back. And then running backs usually is 1. So it's just how often is a back going to be out there. Third down snaps don't really matter as much, but the average running back usually will take about 60-70% of his team's backfield non-quarterback design runs, and it'll be out there about half the time on routes, because they'll block about 20% of the time. And so you kind of know these rates. Tight ends, they're kind of similar to running backs in the blocking rate, unless they're just a glorified slot guy. But all these things are predictable, and then that's how you kind of get your passing projections. Whereas when we talk about running backs, I'm curious how you evaluate running back, given that at one point it was just, okay, volume is more important than efficiency, but now every running back's volume has kind of gone down. So efficiency is clearly important, just as Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry drafters last year.
Right.
So how do you kind of look at the running back position in terms of an evaluation, what goes into it?
Yeah, so running back, we have a lot of running back by committees where, some running backs get more work on, say, early downs, goal line work, whereas other running backs might see more work in the passing game. So I kind of project running backs in buckets like that. But I think more importantly, when it comes to running backs, I do my big running back upside piece where I project, at least heading into week 1, the expected touches for each running back when everyone's healthy, and then how that might shift if any one of the running backs, whether it's the starter or the backup, miss time. Because I think that's important to kind of gauge. That's their ceiling is a scenario where their teammate that they're sharing this work with misses time, and how much of more of the pie do they pick up. So I look at it like a 3-dimensional lens in that way of, who's getting what when everyone's healthy, and then what happens when somebody gets hurt. So again, it's different levels. It's, the running the ball between the 20s, around the goal line, and pass catching work. And that's really kind of how all these running backs sort out. So yeah, that's why running back it's very tricky to project because there's a lot of moving pieces. And at the end of the day, their end of season value can depend on some luck. It's if their teammate was healthy all season or not. A lot of that comes into play. So that's a lot of what I'm looking at is projecting everybody healthy, and then when they're hurt, and then kind of gauging everyone's upside from there.
Exactly, because the average running back is going to average about 4.5 yards a carry. So you're talking about, okay, the best guys in the league are going to get you like 5, and the worst are going to still get you like 4. Now, I know there's more variance to that, but
right.
that simplifies it a bit. And even per target, running backs aren't getting much more than that. It's around, I think, 6 per target. So there's a lot more to be gained by, and this is something key. Another one of those edges that we talked about off the top. There's a lot of different ways to get edges. Part of it is being accurate with your prognostications and rankings and projections and whatnot. But there's so many other things that go into that maybe it's just harder to be good at. And so the more of an edge you can have on it, the better. And I think one of the big things for me has been understanding the organizational philosophy of a team, of the coaches, because a lot of times, especially with running backs, there's a lot out of their control. But what's in somebody's control is what role they play. To your point, are they going to play only early downs? Are they trusted in pass protection? Do they have to play pass protection just because someone else can't? So like a Kyron Williams, he was out there almost all the time, but he didn't catch many balls because he ended up having to protect because they didn't really want Corum to do it, so they gave him his touches early. It's like if you watch basketball, a Knicks situation where you got to get Mitch Rob his minutes in the third quarter because in the fourth, he's just a complete liability. So there's certain situations where a running back could actually get hurt from his backup being bad at something. And that's why I tend to find third down work is not really as important as just being a good pass catcher so you get targets on early downs. Because if you're catching the ball on third down, it probably means your team's punting. So just things like that to keep in mind, and then understanding the organization. What are they looking for out of a running back? Sometimes you get guys come in and say, we're going to run this guy into the ground. Like you kind of saw that coming with the Eagles because they paid, they paid a hefty price for Saquon, where, sometimes you see the opposite. You see, okay, there's been more of a committee. This coach like Shanahan, we talk about it all the time. It's even if you're trying to find that handcuff for McCaffrey, be careful because it's usually the guy after the guy after the guy in the Chiefs backfield. The guy who's coming into the year as the number one guy hardly ever hits because Andy Reid doesn't like to run, and so that creates variance in itself. And then he's not very loyal to. They don't place a high premium on their running back room in the sense of. It's all about Mahomes in the passing game. So, and really just Mahomes so everyone else is interchangeable. They'll switch guys up if they need to very quickly. And so just kind of understanding things like that can give you a big edge. Cause again, a lot of times what it can do is put you on to fading somebody that maybe no one else has a strong opinion about. So they're not necessarily fading that player. Even if they're, it's not he's not a guy that's being taken aggressively. And those are the little pivots that end up winning your league. Cause again, you have so many, you have all the picks to potentially win, even when you're not drafting. So that's how I kind of see it. And I want to close it out though, Sean, with some great tips that you give every year to people who are still playing in leagues where you draft a kicker or a defense or both, which I would say are most leagues. Probably best ball is the only one that's taken them out completely. So talk to me about your strategies for kicker and defense in leagues that draft them.
Well, my strategy is I have none because what I like to do is, unless some leagues, they force you to draft a kicker or defense, you can get around this still with my approach, but I don't draft or kicker or defense for a couple reasons. First is those two positions are very easy to stream in season. They're very matchup dependent. So every week I'm going to have a guy widely available ranked inside my top 5 or 10 most weeks. And I could usually churn out, a top 10 kicker, top 10 defense that way. So I just don't like spending draft capital on them. So what I like to do is I like to just take a couple more lottery picks of like backup. It could even be like a third string running back, just running backs that, um, you know, usually we're drafting during preseason where, a running back could tweak his ankle and be now questionable for week one or miss time. So I've done this over the years of just taking an extra couple running backs. And it's cashed out a couple times. I think the first time I did it was when Le'Veon Bell, there was some concern he might get suspended or something like that. So I just drafted James Conner with my last pick. And sure enough, right before the season started, I believe, Le'Veon Bell was suspended like 4 games or something like that. So all of a sudden, I had the Steelers starting running back for free. I could have drafted, some kicker, but instead I now had the RB1 for the Steelers. So that oh no, Le'Veon Bell is a holdout that year.
Yeah.
That's what happened. So
yeah,
anything can happen where I just, take a couple flyers and then you just wait and see if they hit. Usually they don't. And then, come week one, when it's time to, actually need a kicker defense, that's when I add my kicker and defense for week one and then kind of go from there. But I think it's just a tiny little quirk. We're looking for all the edges we can, right? So more times than not, it won't pan out, but there's a chance it could hit. That's why I call them lottery tickets. But just at the end of the day, if you can, don't draft a kicker defense. Instead, just, take a couple flyers to see what happens the next, final week or two before the season starts.
Yeah. And that is like just the most, like, I think the people who needed to hear that are going to benefit so much from it, because it's just something that you don't even think, like, I didn't even think about that before you said it. It maybe have happened by accident, but I wasn't like purposely doing it. Like, it's just such a great strategy. And I think that's really how you have to think about these leagues, is that there are so many edges you could have. Like, for example, I think there's also a lot of experts that don't maybe put as much into their kicker and defense projection. So there are things that, when you're like, the easy way to do it is you just look at a point projection for the team, which essentially usually comes down to their Vegas implied team total. How many points Vegas has is their, median each week but there are other things. And there's also, just in general, you got to be paying attention to league-wide trends. I mean, there's more field goals than ever last year, and a lot of leagues are giving more points for longer field goals now. And so there are going to be edges to be had at kicker. So don't, we like to just joke around a lot, because they're, of all the things we're doing, kickers usually have like among the least priorities, but there's still edges to be had at kicker in terms of the actual project evaluation process too. So there's, whatever edges at your disposal, do them. And that's why I would say too, when you talk about not drafting a kicker or defense, I've applied that to pretty much every position but running back in certain drafts, because I mentioned earlier, there's gonna we look for about a certain number of wide receivers in the early rounds, and then they kind of run out, and they're all interchangeable. Then it's like a frozen pond of wide receivers, except they're backup, so it doesn't matter. But if I draft 5 receivers in the first 10 rounds, even if I only drafted 4, and it's a 2 wide receiver league or something, it might not make sense for me to have a guy on my roster when I could pick up anyone when it comes time for that, or multiple guys. So it's really about just maximizing your roster spot. And if you're going to be a commissioner and play an active role in that in your leagues, it is something to kind of think about too, how you want to approach that, because these are some of the edges that I think go overlooked when everyone's just screaming about their favorite late round dart throw that's got like a 1% chance of hitting. So
you made a fantastic point about kickers and defenses. I still, care about my projections and rankings for them, but especially in season, when you and we talk about, our waiver wire streamer picks for the week, we're both taking it very seriously with our projections. So we'll be breaking down kickers and defenses every week. based on what you said, there's all these factors that go into it that are, matchup specific, things like that, or like the environment they're playing in. So during the season, I absolutely take it seriously because that's kind of what I do. I just roll with the flow during the season. I'm adding, dropping kickers and defenses every week. So it's very important to have good weekly projections on those, which we both do. And that's a great point of during the season, we take kickers and defenses very seriously.
Yeah, it's just right at certain points, even when you're drafting in late August, anyone will do. It's like you ever been at a bar with a too late in college? You kind of know what I'm talking about. So we'll wrap it up with that. And this has been the 7th annual Fantasy Flex Experts Guide to Fantasy. Thanks for tuning in. We'll have plenty of more NFL content on both the Action Network podcast and, of course, right here on the Fantasy Flex. So be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen. And I spoke about this a couple times, I think, earlier, but make sure to mark your calendar for our live event, August 23rd at Joe's on Weed Street in Chicago. It's totally free to attend. You just need to RSVP. I'll be there. Sean will be there. I think we're going to have some special guests as well. So be sure to RSVP if you want to come through and kick it with us. And, of course, if you're trying to find Sean, he's at the _oddsmaker. I'm at Chris Raybon. We're at those same handles on the free award-winning Action app as we are on X. And until next time, all I got to say, let's get this money.